In the last video, I began to touch on the concept that everything is mind, and how I defined mind is as a self-observing observer. And so I want to expand on what I started to explain at the end of that video, which is that all is one mind. So what do I mean by that? Well, all information that interacts requires a common medium. So as we discussed in the previous video, when we are in the beginning state of the universe, we have no information, but we have an observer. And so when an observer is observing itself, what it's observing is nothingness, because what information does it contain? It contains nothingness. But because it's an observer and not just nothingness itself, because it's observing itself as nothingness, it's conceptualizing the nothingness inside of itself, right? So again, we go back to the analogy of when we think of what is outside of the house that we can't see outside of, it's conceptual nothingness, it's uncertainty. And so what we're looking at when we're a self-observing observer is that nothingness as a concept, right? We're trying to understand, we're trying to comprehend it as nothingness. So when we do that, we can create multiple points of nothingness to begin interacting with each other, which I'll explain later with the fundamental equation, to begin interacting with each other, and that creates objects, right? It creates information that can be used and transformed into all these different forms and interactions, all this different potential. So why is all mind one mind? Well, if you think about it, if the original state is nothingness and we have an observer that's observing itself, well, in order for anything to interact, it has to exist in the same universe, right? This is what this means. And so you and I are only able to talk because we exist in the same universe. If we didn't exist in the same universe, we would have no way for my information to reach you or for your information to reach me, right? There has to be a medium. There has to be a bridge between our selves in order for ourselves to interact, in order for us as objects to interact, and for us as information to interact. And so that concept of having a bridge is a common medium, right? Like if you think of like comic books or something like that, in order for two characters from two different comic books to interact with each other, they have to have a crossover, right? Well, what does it mean to have a crossover? It means that you're implying that they both exist in the same universe. If I write a story and you write a story, and our stories don't imply that your character exists in my universe, then those characters would never interact, right? Even if they explored that entire implied universe, they would hypothetically never encounter each other because our characters don't exist in the same universe as each other. So basically what I'm saying is that as far as that original observer, as it conceptualizes nothingness inside of itself, all future interactions are taking place within that observer. And the analogy I like to use for this is a dream. I'm going to be using the dream analogy a lot. I think it's a very good analogy for a lot of things within my model. And so how I'm using it here is to say, picture yourself dreaming at night. That dream includes you, right? You are a self within the dream, and yet you are also the dreamer. So this is kind of a variation of conceptualized information within the self. So you have a concept of yourself inside yourself. That is your dream character, your dream avatar, right? But you aren't actually inside yourself. You are the mind that is having the dream, which means you are also the entire universe. That dream universe is your mind. Nothing that exists in that universe doesn't exist in your mind. And everything that exists in that universe exists in your mind, right? So you are the observer, and all the information inside of you that is being observed is that dream world. So as you explore the dream world, you're creating information from your own mind by dividing your mind up into these pieces, into these aspects, and then interacting with it. So what I'm saying the universe is, our universe, is one mind, one self-observing observer. You can call it God, you can call it the source, whatever you want. That one self-observing observer is the container which contains all information in this universe, right? It generates and contains all information in this universe. So anything that's here, you, me, all the information, all the pool balls, all the atoms, all the electrons, all the photons, all the people and aliens, everything that can exist or ever will exist or ever has existed exists within that one observer. Okay? So that's what I mean by all mind is one mind. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that my mind and your mind are identical objects, right? Just like if there's a dream character, let's say Jill, right? Jill and you can talk to Jill in your dream. So is Jill you? Well, yes, in the sense that you and Jill are both from the same mind, right? And that mind is you. But you and Jill are not the same character within the narrative of the dream. So you have to understand that separate objects within the dream don't necessarily mean that they're ultimately separate. Okay, this is a very non-dual concept of reality, like a Buddhist Eastern Dharmic concept of reality, that we can be physically separate without being separate spiritually, separate as mind. So again, I think that the dream is a really apt analogy for that, and we'll get more into it later, but I think that's adequate for now. So let's translate this concept of the dream dividing the self, the mind, into these multiple aspects that can then interact, and what we talked about previously of the mind as a self-observing observer, translating the nothingness outside of itself into the nothingness inside of itself, right? So if we have, let's get rid of this real quick. So if we have nothingness outside of ourself, and we have nothingness inside of ourself, nothingness is all that exists, right? But we do have nothingness. That does exist. And I know that's a confusing concept to say that nothingness exists. But again, think of it from the perspective of a self-observing observer. If you are the self-observing observer, the mind, and you're observing yourself, what exists inside of you? The concept of nothingness, right? And again, I don't mean the complex concept of like how a brain interprets it. I mean the raw information, the data, the concept of nothingness that exists because that's all that the observer is interacting with is nothingness. And so as the observer contains nothingness, it can observe itself to interact with that nothingness and conceptualize it as a object. It can quantify it essentially. So what does quantifying an object of nothingness look like? Well, let's get into the fundamental equation, which is 0 equals x minus x. So 0 is the quantified nature of nothingness, and nothingness is the whole, right? So what we're talking about, the whole being this one mind, it's one self-observing observer, right? And nothingness being what it contains, because there's nothing except for the observer. So all it has as a concept of itself, when it observes itself, the only concept of itself it has is nothingness. When it tries to quantify itself, when it tries to interact with itself internally, all it's interacting with is nothingness. There's nothingness inside and nothingness outside. So when it interacts with that nothingness, we're going to conceptualize that as a quantified 0, okay? So think about the information that it contains is it contains 0 on the inside and 0 on the outside. But since it can't interact with the 0 on the outside, except to conceptualize it internally, what we're really working with is the 0 inside of itself, right? The conceptualized nothing. So when we take 0 and we apply the fundamental equation, what does that look like? What does it look like to take nothingness, the concept of nothingness, and to multiply it into different aspects like we do in a dream? Well, 0 times 0 equals 0. Well, that doesn't help, right? 0 plus 0 equals 0. We all understand basic math here. My math is very simple. I'm not a mathematician, so everything I do with math is quite simple. So we all understand this, right? We're not getting anywhere. We're not making any progress. 0 times or multiplied by or divided by or subtracted from or whatever, it's always going to be the same. It's 0. So how do we get from 0, how do we get from this whole of nothingness, this big observer full of nothingness, to somethingness? Well, the fundamental equation would say that 0 equals, let's say 1 minus 1, right? That's x minus x. An example of that is 1 minus 1. Now this could be anything, right? 0 equals 100 minus 100. All of these are conceptually the same. It does not matter. All right. All that we're really representing is if you have a whole, right, like this circle right here, and you divide the whole in half. Sorry, that's not exactly half. We'll get as close as we can. There we go. If you divide the whole in half, then what you have is 2 halves of 1, right? Now, where does the negative and the positive come from? Well, that's the relationship between them, right? They're polarized relative to each other. All right, so if we think of this as the bottom half and the top half, right, what we're talking about is if the bottom half is plus 1, then the negative or the top half is the opposite of that half, right? So what is the opposite of positive 1? It's going to be negative 1. So it's polarized due to the fact that they are opposite halves, not because they inherently have a negative or a positive charge. We're not talking about like like in physics, how something has a negative or positive charge. Although I do think that fundamentally that comes from this. It comes from this through a very complicated topic or concept that we're not really going to get into yet. But at a basic level, all we're really saying right now is that if you take a whole, like the self-observing observer, even if what it's full of is nothingness, if you divide that nothingness in half, what you get is two opposite halves. And the two opposite halves are different from the whole, right? So if the whole is 0, it's not going to be -0 and +0, right? Because they're fundamentally different. Would you say that this half is the same as the whole? No, you couldn't, because this half contains less information than the whole, and therefore different information than the whole. The whole would be represented as fundamentally different than a half of the whole. So because these two halves have a relationship to each other that is polarized due to them being opposites of each other, they have a positive and a negative charge relative to each other. So now we get the equation 0 equals 1 minus 1, or 0 equals x minus x, which is basically just saying that two halves of a whole also make up the whole. But because they're now two halves, we have 2 halves, right? Now we have these objects that I'm talking about, right? So we can think of this as a negative and a positive object contained within the nothingness of the one observer or the one mind, okay? So now we can start to conceptualize, how do we get from this to the universe? Well, guess what? We can do this at infinity, right? So let's say we have 0 equals 100 minus 100, right? We'll start with easy numbers. So now we can do 0 equals, let's say, 50 plus 50 equals, let's say, 25 plus 75, right? Look at how we're getting different numbers from the same equation, but it always equals the same. Oops, I didn't mean equals, I meant plus. Yeah, if I could actually type, that'd be great. Okay, so this is still 100, right? And this is still 100. So this equation is fundamentally the same as this equation, but specifically it's not. So the same way, right, that the whole is equal to its parts, but yet the parts are different from the whole, this is the same thing. We're doing the same, we're repeating the same pattern over and over again. The whole was 0, and we broke up 0 into 100 minus 100. And now we're breaking up 100 into 50 plus 50, or 25 plus 75. And we can keep doing this down farther and farther and farther. And you can imagine that we could get a complicated equation that has an infinite number of numbers, which means that if we come back to this model, we have an infinite number infinite number of conceptual objects, right? So you can start to see how you can create a universe just like the dream, right? Just like the dream can create an infinite universe within your one mind by breaking up the whole into aspects of yourself. We have the one mind, the source mind, whatever you want to call it, God, breaking itself up into aspects of itself by dividing itself through a very simple process of observing itself. And now you have an infinite number of objects that exist relative to each other, that are polarized relative to each other, and we can build the entire universe from this. And all that's necessary is to be able to say the statement that the parts must always add up to the whole. And that makes sense, right? It makes sense because if we come back to this point down here, all information that interacts requires a common medium. In other words, all information that is contained, that is interacting with each other, is contained within a single whole. No matter how many numbers you break this up into, it will always add up to this because it is all part of a single whole. If I take a sphere, no matter how many times I cut that sphere up, all those pieces will add back together like a puzzle, right? Because if I take the puzzle, it doesn't matter what pattern I cut the puzzle up into, those puzzle pieces will always fit back together because they come from each other. We all, you and I, and all the animals and all the rocks and every particle in this universe, to quote, we are all made of stardust, we all come from each other. We all come from the same whole. It's the same system recycling its singular energy, which actually adds up to 0. There's zero energy in this universe. But because of the way the mind conceptualizes the zero energy, it can break the energy up into positive and negative energy. So we can get positive and negatively charged particles and matter and objects and minds and people. We can get all these narratives, this complex world, from nothingness. Okay? So let's kind of use some basic examples of what I'm kind of talking about in both physics and real world examples. So this is a wave, right? Well, let's look at this wave. What is this? Well, this is positive and this is negative, right? And the wave, in order to, so this is zero, the neutral line is zero. Why is it zero? Because it has no fluctuation, right? There's only one static state, and one static state cannot differentiate itself from itself, right? But once you add polarity, once you add differences, right? Again, we're talking about the fundamental equation here. Once you break it up into differences, then you can get this fluctuation, you can get this movement, and the movement is only perceived through the differences. Because there's an up and a down, because there's polarity, because there's opposites, you can perceive the movement of this wave. But if there's no difference, it's the same amount of energy, right? +1 and -1 equals 0. We understand this. So it's the same amount of energy contained in nothingness or somethingness. And that's what I'm trying to explain by all mind is one, and it's all a self-observing nothing state. It's the same amount of energy in the wave, whether you go up or down. It's all got to add up to the same neutral state. And let's look at it as a more like practical real world example. So let's say, for example, that I want to dig a hole, right? Let's say that I dig a hole like this in order to create a hill that's like this, right? Well, what is this? This is -1 and this is +1, or -x, +x. Right? It's such a simple concept. We have this neutral ground, right, which is 0. This ground is 0. And then when we disturb 0 by self-observing, which is the digging process, we create differences. And in creating those differences, we create the ability to perceive complexity in the non-complex nothingness. Okay? So anytime you take something away to add something else, you're creating that spectrum, right? And when we create the spectrum between negative and positive and neutral in between, we're creating the equation. This is 0, this is -x, and this is +x. So it's possible from nothing at all to get something. And that is mathematically true. It is mathematically demonstrable. So hopefully that continues to pique your interest and show you that, hey, this is actually going somewhere. It's not just a bunch of BS. It's not just a bunch of like spiritual woo-woo. There's actually something to this. There's actually correlations between the way math and the physical universe work and the way that I'm presenting this mental model of how the universe can only do what it does if we use the mind as its fundamental basis. If everything exists within the mind, then we can use this sort of dream model of reality to understand like, hey, look, the universe is essentially a self-observing mind that is dreaming. That is essentially what this is. And we can explain from that, crazy enough, how we get everything, how we get all the differences that we see in the universe, and how all of it adds back up to that one single mind that many people would like to call God. I don't necessarily feel the need to call it God, but if you want to, then go for it. So we'll talk more next time.